Hey, thank you, Jay. Appreciate it. Good evening. Good to have everyone with us this evening. We are grateful that you are with us. Let me put in a promotional plug, if you don't mind. Last Thursday morning, George had a tremendous class and looking at the Bible chronologically, and we would be glad to have you in that class. It was a good class, and George did a tremendous job, and know he will this week as well. And so if you're available from 10 to 11 on Thursday morning, just find out the conference number and join in, and I think you'll be blessed by it. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to Mark chapter 13. We're going to begin there in verse 32. Mark 13, verse 32. While you're turning there, we've been giving everyone every week a little something at least to crack a smile about, if not laugh about. I'll tell you about a story that I read not long ago about a little boy by the name of Zachary. Zachary was 4 years old, and he was home with his mom, and she was in one part of the house and he was in the other, and she heard him all of a sudden kind of scream out, and so she went to where he was, and what's the matter? I've dropped my toothbrush in the toilet. And so she fishes it out and she throws it away, and he kind of looks at that and she says, oh, we can't bother it, it's nasty. And so he goes then and runs to another part of the house and comes back with her toothbrush, and he says, well, then you might want to throw this away because I dropped it in the toilet about a week ago. So needless to say, something maybe just to kind of give your face a little workout, a little grin there to think about. But we're ready for Mark chapter 13, and if you'll recall, last week we began Mark chapter 13, and the equivalent of Mark 13 is Matthew chapter 24 and Matthew chapter 25. There in Matthew, we find that there are really two questions that are asked as they're coming out of the temple, they being Jesus and some that are with him. They look back and they see the beautiful edifice, the beautiful building of the temple, and Jesus tells them that there's going to come a time in which one stone will not stand or sit upon the other, and they're wanting to know, well, when's that going to happen? But Matthew's account gives us two questions. When is that going to happen? And when is the end of time, or when shall the Lord come again? And so Mark doesn't really show us but the one question, but Matthew shows us that there was two. In Matthew 24, you go down to about verse 36, and there's a transition there. And then the rest of Matthew 24 and all of Matthew 25 deals with the second coming of the Lord. Well, we're in Mark's account, and notice that we're trying to pretty much just stay in Mark's account. Mark's account, we're at verse 32, we're at the transition. Up until then, and what we talked about last week, there were signs that Jesus gave those that were there. There were signs that were going to take place when the temple would be destroyed. Now, that happened in AD 70. And so, depending upon how you look at a calendar, either AD 33 or AD 30, Jesus is talking, and probably AD 30. And so 40 years later, all of the signs that Jesus had dealt with, say in Matthew 24 or in Mark chapter 13, 1 through 31 for the most part, those signs had come to pass and the temple was destroyed. It was never rebuilt after that. But verse 32 begins, but, and the word but here is a transition word. And notice that it says of that day. Now, if you look back in the 13th chapter of the book of Mark, you'll notice, especially in verses 17, 19, 20, and 24, it talks about in those days. But now in verse 32, it talks about that day, that specific day. And so there's a transition here. The word but shows us that. The word but is a signal word, if you will. When you look at that, you need to see that you're moving from one thought to another. You're changing thoughts. Now, I know not always when you see that word, but there is a transition here. It's a transition really from those days to that day. And here in Mark chapter 13, beginning in verse 32, Jesus is talking about the second coming, when he would come again. And he says, of that day and that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. There have been a lot of folks that have guessed when Jesus would come again. There have been those that have tried to apply certain signs from the Bible that are incorrect, such as the ones in the first part of this chapter that dealt with the destruction of Jerusalem to the second coming of the Lord. Some have tried to fix the book of Revelation with regards to the second coming of the Lord. And there have been a multitude of individuals that have tried to say, well, the Lord's coming on this day or that day or this other day. I found it interesting back in 1998 that a fellow by the name of Wisenott came out with a little book he sent to everybody. It said 88 reasons why the Lord's coming in 1988. And then when he didn't come in 1988, he sent out a subsequent book, the 89 reasons why the Lord's coming in 1989. Well, he didn't come then either. Harold Camp in recent years has made several predictions with regards to the coming of the end of the time. But notice what Jesus said. No one knows the hour. The angels in heaven don't know it. I don't know it. And so Jesus couldn't even give hints as far as when it was going to happen. And so when individuals began to set dates, they're very presumptuous. Because in this paragraph, Jesus basically is saying, look, I don't know. He's going to come, and notice what he says in verse 33, take heed, watch, and pray. The word watch there has the idea of being alert, staying on the ready, staying awake. And so he says, you take heed that you stay awake and that you pray, that you do not know when the time is. It is like a man. And so Jesus says you don't know when it is. And so now he's going to kind of give them an application. It's like a man that goes to a far country who's left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Now, it's like a man that has a lot of money, has a lot of servants, and he tells the servants, okay, you basically keep working until I come back. Don't miss a day, don't miss an hour. You carry forth your job. I'm not here, but you carry it forth, and I'll come back. And notice that he said that he would give even the doorkeeper, he would command to watch. The doorkeeper there would be the chief or the head of all the servants. And so Jesus says, then watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming. Here's his application. This master has put all of his servants to work. He says, don't just because I'm not here, don't lay around in bed. Don't lay around and do nothing. Don't lay around and just say, well, the boss is not here. We don't have to do anything. He says, watch because you don't know when I'm coming back. And in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning. He said, lest coming suddenly, he finds you sleeping. And so he says, stay awake, be alert. I say unto you, I say to all, watch. What's the application for us? Well, the application is that in this second coming of the Lord, we don't know when he's coming back. We don't know the day, the hour, the minute that he's coming. We can talk about the greatness of that second coming. We can talk about how that it will be a great noise, it will be a great event, it will be a great time. We can talk about the passing of or we could first of all talk about the trumpet shall sound, the passing of this earth as it is consumed by fire, and the noise that would make. We can talk about it being a great day because it's the end of all of our problems and all of our difficulties and beginning eternity with the Lord. But the great application for this paragraph is this: be ready for that great day. Now, some would say, and some might call that, that's really rough. Why doesn't he just tell us so that we can get ready? Well, he's telling you it's going to happen. And so it's a reality that you can bank on. Now, there are those that in times past have said, well, he's not coming back, so we're just going to do what we want to do. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4 said that because the Lord tarries, basically they said, why should we do anything? All things have continued from the beginning up to this point in time. In other words, he's not really coming back. Well, you can trust the fact that he's coming back. And not only can you trust the fact that he's coming back, but you don't know when he's coming back. And so he says, you just be ready for it. You just be prepared. You just know that it's going to take place. Well, some would say, well, that's me. No, because the Lord wants his work carried forth. His work is important. The work of letting our light shine before men, that they can see the Lord is the purpose for our life and our ministry. And in doing that, he says, you just keep doing that. I don't want any fake. I don't want any pretense. I liken it unto this. I knew of a missionary once that in the mission field where he worked, there were some that through the years in that mission work, they had withdrawn from. They had gone into, some of them had gone into spiritism and different false teachings. And so the church, the brethren, the faithful brethren had withdrawn from these brethren. But these brethren were receiving money from churches in the United States and from a particular brother in particular. And they were supporting these wayward people because they didn't know that they were wayward. And consequently, when the Americans would come, they'd let this false missionary know, hey, we're going to be in town. We're coming. We're going to be there for the weeks of so-and-so and so-and-so. And so then what would happen is this man would, because he'd been receiving this monthly support, he'd find these individuals that were from his country, and he would pay them, and he would get them to come, or he would promise them something, and he'd have a group that would be there. And so then these Americans would come, they'd see this, they'd go back to the United States, they'd talk about how the church was flourishing under this brother and how wonderful he was as a preacher and so forth and so on. And he would go back, and when they would come back to the States, the group would dismiss, he'd lay around, he'd do nothing. He wasn't a faithful servant. Jesus wants faithful servants, and that's why Jesus says, look, God set it up so that you just keep doing what you're supposed to be doing, no matter what. And so that reminds us to keep doing and to keep serving the Lord as God has dictated for us. Now I would ask for questions and comments. And so I'm sure you've got some, but just hold on to those or keep studying for yourself. There are some other events in Matthew, especially Matthew's account of the gospel or John's account of the gospel, that are in between Mark 13 and 14. But now we transition to Mark chapter 14. We transition also from Tuesday to Wednesday of the last week of the life of Christ. And Mark begins, he says, after 2 days it was the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. Okay, let's get you set time-wise. understand that the Feast of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this was one of those 3 times that all Jewish men were, if possible, to come back to Jerusalem. And so usually a Jewish man 3 times out of the year would make a Mecca or a journey to Jerusalem for the feast, if the particular feasts that were being honored. Now remember, there were 7 feasts in all, but there were 3 that they had to go back to Jerusalem for, Passover being one of them. The Passover, of course, was that feast that reminded them of the time in which the death angel passed over and the children of Israel were told by Pharaoh, leave. And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasted for a week, was a time in which basically you didn't eat, you ate bread that was unleavened, but it was to remind them of the time in which they had left quickly, and they were thus in the wilderness after they had been in Egyptian bondage for so many years. Nevertheless, it is at this time many of the Jewish men would have been in Jerusalem. And the chief priests and the scribes, of course, being those that hand wrote the law, the chief priests being the religious leaders. And so both of these groups were actually religious leaders and on the Sanhedrin. They wanted to put Jesus to death. They'd had enough of his teachings. They'd had enough of his actions. They'd had enough. And they just, let's put him to death. But in this little short chapter or a little short paragraph, Mark says, no, they decided that not during the feast, that was not a good time. There's too many people. There'd be too much of an uproar. There'd be too many folks saying something. And so let's move forward. And so they do. And so let's talk about then the next paragraph is the anointing at Bethany. It's kind of interesting from this point forward to watch the contrast in how people receive, act towards, and act concerning Jesus Christ. Here we have a lady that shows great love, great loyalty, and great adoration for the Lord. Being in Bethany. Now, Bethany was about 5 or 6 miles southeast of Jerusalem. Is actually during the last week of the life of Christ, where Jesus goes back and forth from Bethany to Jerusalem on a daily basis. And so being in Bethany, he was at the house of Simon the leper, and he sat at the table. A woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. But there were some that were indignant among themselves, said, why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me you do not have always. She's done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as memorial to her. This is a great little story. It really, there's a great sermon here. I've preached it before, not here at River Road. But do what you can with what you have where you are. That's really what this Mary does. This Mary is, John tells us in his account, and this is an account that's found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, interestingly enough. But this is Mary of Bethany. This is the sister of Martha and of Lazarus. Jesus is in the house of Simon the leper, and Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, comes, and she breaks open an alabaster box. An alabaster box was a stone. Alabaster is a stone, a soft stone. It could be scooped out. There are several different if you will, definitions of an alabaster flask. Some have said that it was a box and that it was scooped out and then it had a lid on it, and thus the ointment sat in that box. Some have said it was more like a bottle of today that usually, while hollowed out, would only allow a drop to come out at a time. But when she broke it open, she probably broke the neck of it so that it could be poured out. Well, I don't know exactly what the container looked like. It had something that it could be broken. It was definitely, from the standpoint of alabaster, it was, like we said, a softer stone that had been carved out. It was able to be a container to hold what is called spikenard. She broke the flask and she poured the spikenard on his head. Now, the spikenard was a very costly, very aromatic fragrance. Matter of fact, usually was diluted quite a bit because it was so strong and also because it was so expensive. It seems, especially from John's account, that this spikenard had not been diluted, that it is, if you will allow me to say this, pure spikenard oil. And not only has it not been diluted, but we gather also from John's account in John chapter 12 and verse 3, he tells us how much that it is, and it's basically 12 ounces. And so she anoints the head and the feet, but she anoints the head of Jesus. And there are some folks, and John tells us most definitely at least one, who was indignant. It was Judas, one of the 12. And he's indignant because he says, why is this wasted? Now, interestingly enough, this word wasted here that Judas uses, a little later on when Judas is called the son of perdition, that's the same word. That word perdition there, the Greek word, is the same word that's used for wasted here. And so Judas is asked, why in the world was his life wasted? Well, here we see that Judas asked a question, why is the oil wasted? Now, John, and you know, we've been trying to stick with just Mark, but we've got to throw in a couple of things. John gives us some insight on why Judas would be the one that say that. John 12, John says that this he said, not that he cared for the poor, but that he bore the bag and was a thief. In other words, John tells us that Judas was the treasurer, the keeper of the money for the apostles, and Judas was evidently dipping out of the till. But Judas is indignant. Why in the world isn't this money? Why isn't this ointment sold and the money given, of course, to the poor? Look what he says. He says in verse 5, why it could have been sold for 300 denarii. A denarii was a day's wages. This is approximately, he's saying this is about a year's wages. I mean, this is a year's wages. It's worth a year's wages without paying your expenses. If you could save what you made every day for a year and not spend a dime, not spend even a penny on anything, that year's wages is what that was worth. But I want you to think about something here. It wasn't just Judas, it was others, because it says plural, doesn't tell us who, but it says, and they criticized her sharply. I want to just stop right here and go on and make an application right here. You can do good and still be criticized. You can do a good work and still people talk about you. You can help somebody that's in need whether it's financially or physically or mentally, emotionally, I guess we should say. You can help them, and somebody will say something about it. You can go out and you can do something in the name of the Lord that lets your light shine before men, and somebody can still say something about it. Now, first of all, that doesn't mean that it's right. And it doesn't mean that they are correct and doing good in the criticism of what you're doing. But it can and will happen. When we are criticized, I think we need to remember several things. We, first of all, need to acknowledge the criticism. I know Jerry Barber, that was here before me, that Jerry probably gave you a few lessons on criticism. But let me give you my part. First of all, you got to acknowledge criticism. In other words, okay, here's the criticism. I understand what I'm being criticized for. It may not be right, but I understand. And so you acknowledge it. You accept the criticism. Okay, I need to accept it. I need to think about it. Admittedly, some folks are better at criticism than they are at compliments, and that's a shame. We should be better at compliments than we are criticism. We should be better at praising people and encouraging people than we would be at criticizing and discouraging people. But nevertheless, having acknowledged the criticism, we accept it. And thus we analyze it. Is it true? Is it right? Is it worthy of my consideration? And then we actuate what part of it that we might need to change or do different or do better. The fact that you're criticized, don't let it get to you. Oh, I know it will. Criticism gets to me. I think I usually spend several days when someone has criticized something I've done. But turn it, if you will, not inward to destroy yourself, but turn it in such a way as to say, okay, where can I grow in these areas? And if there's no room for growth, then, maybe the criticism is unjust. And yes, there is unjust criticism. There's unfounded criticism, unjust criticism. But nevertheless, we need to sit and think about it. Now, this woman, she really didn't need to sit and think about it, those that had criticized her. The reason being because Jesus says what she's done is a good thing. And so Jesus says, leave her alone. Don't bother her. Don't trouble her. She's done a good thing. He says, the poor you'll have with you always, but I'm fixed to leave. Jesus had talked about his death. Jesus really knew, I believe, that his death was very soon. Matter of fact, it's just hours from when we're talking about this event. And I believe that Jesus knew that. He had told his apostles that he was going to die. He had even set face to go back to Jerusalem, and they told him when he set his face to go back to Jerusalem, they said, Lord, they're going to kill you there. And Jesus said, I got to go. And they said, well, we'll go with you. And so they could have understood that he was going to die. But Jesus understood it, and Jesus was allowing this lady, Mary, to anoint him for what was about to happen, to anoint him for his death and burial. And notice that he even says, she's done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. So she did what she could. She did it with what she had. Boy, it was a great gift, what she gave him. We need to do what we can with what we have. I've heard people say, well, if I had their money, I'd give it to church. Or if I had their ability to speak, I'd stand up and teach a class, or I'd lead prayer, or I'd, wait on the table. Or if I had their skills, I'd do this or I'd do that. We're supposed to basically look at what we have and see what we can do acknowledge our talents, our abilities, and then use them to the very best of our ability. So she did what she could with what she had, but she did it where she was. We often say, well, if I could go. We don't have to go. We can stay where we are and do. But Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached, wherever this good news, Jesus is giving a hint that some good news is fixing to happen. What is it? His death, burial, and resurrection. He said, wherever it's preached in the whole world, what this woman's done, it'll be told. But it will be told as memorial to her. She will be one that will be seen as being great. Now, let's go on. There's a couple more verses, and then we'll stop. Judas sets if you will, plan into action. Judas, one of the 12, went to the chief priest to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him. Okay, we're going to add a couple of things from some other texts just to help us. It is believed now that because of what Jesus said about Mary and what she has done for him, that Judas takes offense to what Jesus has said. In other words, Jesus has gotten on him and his feelings are hurt. And what does he do? Well, instead of looking at the criticism that Jesus really gave him and acknowledging it and saying, the Lord was right, I shouldn't have said that, he takes it out on the Lord. And so he goes to the chief priest. And basically he says, okay, what can I do? How can I give him over to you? And so he makes a bargain. Judas agrees that for 30 pieces of silver, at an appropriate time, he will walk up, he will kiss the cheek of Jesus, and thus give him away as being the Messiah. 30 pieces of silver. That was a cheap price. That was the price of a slave of that day. For the slave price, Judas sold his soul maybe even more than he already had. He's going to betray the Lord. But that sets us in motion then, and so we'll stop right there. We will begin what will be Thursday then. So the day will flip over. We will begin on Thursday, which is the first day of the unleavened bread. We'll talk about we'll talk about that feast a little bit, and we'll go on into the 14th chapter and probably even talk about the institution of the Lord's Supper next week. I look forward to next week. Next week, you can ask questions. Those that are able to be in the auditorium, able to be with us, and we will be able to see each other and spend time with one another and study God's Word together. And so that'll be a good thing, and we look forward to it. I hope that those of you that feel able will be able to be out. Sunday's supposed to be a beautiful day, maybe a little bit cool, but a beautiful day. And if you feel comfortable and you can get out, we hope that you can. If you can't, just turn your radio or your telephone, dial your telephone to this conference number and just listen to the service like you've been doing. But we're going to talk about, we began on Monday our month with the Master, and so Sunday morning our sermon is on the birth of Christ, especially Matthew chapter 2 and the visit of the Magi. And then Sunday night we're going to look at the baptism of Jesus, beginning in verse 13 of the 3rd chapter of the book of Matthew, and we'll look at that. And so that's kind of how we're going to do it. We're just going to pick out a section or maybe a thought in something that you've read for the week and give a sermon on it. But we hope that you're following along in your study. You're not that far behind. Actually, this is the 3rd, so you can sit down and read 1st, 2nd, 3rd chapters, and don't worry about all the names and the genealogy in the 1st chapter. That gets complicated and they get tongue-tied. You'll get tongue-tied trying to say them. But just know that they're there and understand why and the importance of them. But we hope that you'll be with us Sunday. We look forward to being in person. Well, I hope maybe this study has helped you. I hope that you'll be encouraged by it. We thank you for being with us. And until Sunday, may God bless you and keep you is our prayer.